These are 20 hidden facts about The Far Country, a 1954 Western that most people have seen but almost nobody has looked at closely enough. A horse performed a midnight miracle in a single take, a future Hollywood legend scored the film without receiving a single credit, and a real threatened lawsuit forced the studio to change the villain's name, and that's before we even get to the automobile parked on an 1896 glacier during the opening title sequence. Fact number 1. The film is the fourth in one of cinema's greatest director-star partnerships. The Far Country doesn't stand alone, and understanding where it sits in the larger picture changes everything about how you watch it. Number 4. In a cycle of 5 westerns made between 1950 and 1955, the film followed Winchester 73, Bend of the River, and The Naked Spur, with The Man from Laramie still to come. Every single one of those pictures came from the same team, director Anthony Mann, star James Stewart, and producer Aaron Rosenberg, who assembled this group not just for the westerns, but for 3 additional non-western collaborations on top of them. Variety recognized the pattern in real time, noting in their 1954 review that the film represented the 5th successful combination of James Stewart as star, Aaron Rosenberg as producer, and Anthony Mann as director. What made this cycle matter wasn't simply commercial consistency. TCM's David Starrett placed these films at the exact historical turning point between the larger-than-life westerns of John Ford and Howard Hawks and the darker, morally unstable visions of Sam Peckinpah and Sergio Leone. Rosenberg himself put it plainly, Mann brought out something in James Stewart that hadn't been really seen before. It was an almost manic rage that would suddenly explode. Here was a hero with flaws. French critic Jacques Rivette, writing in 1955, named Mann one of the 4 great directors of post-war Hollywood, and that assessment came directly from watching these films. But to understand how Stewart could play characters like Jeff Webster, isolated, volatile, morally complicated, you have to start 4 years before this film was even made. Fact number 2. World War II transformed James Stewart into the actor who could make these films. On March 22, 1941, Stewart enlisted 9 full months before Pearl Harbor, making him the first major American movie star to join up before the country was even at war. The Army initially turned him away for weighing 138 pounds at 6 feet 3 inches, so he gained the weight, went back and got in. From there, his military path was extraordinary by any measure. He deployed to England commanding the 703rd Bombardment Squadron, 445th Bomb Group, flying B-24 Liberator heavy bombers over some of the most heavily defended targets in occupied Europe, 20 combat missions over Berlin, Brunswick, Bremen, Frankfurt, and Schweinfurt, including a 1,000-plane raid on Berlin that he led as flight leader. His rank climbed from private to full colonel in less than 5 years, and decorations came in the form of 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 4 Air Medals, and the French Croix de Guerre with Palm. On July 23, 1959, a promotion to Brigadier General made him the highest-ranking actor in American military history, and in February of 1966, at 57 years old, he flew as a non-duty observer on a B-52 mission over Vietnam. His retirement on May 31, 1968, closed out 27 years of combined service. None of those facts, though, quite capture what the war did to him on the inside, and that's the part that matters for understanding these westerns. His daughter Kelly put it this way: "My father's experiences during World War II affected him more deeply and permanently than anything else in his life. The man who came home carried what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress, and that internal damage, that specific unresolvable darkness, became the engine that powered everything he did with Anthony Mann." Clint Eastwood described the effect with real precision. He wasn't a violent-looking man, but he could portray violence. He could portray anger better than almost any other actor. The Far Country exists, in the most direct sense possible, because a gentle man went to war and returned as someone else. Fact number 3. Stewart earned $300,000 without taking a standard salary. $300,000 came to Stewart from The Far Country without him accepting a single dollar of traditional upfront pay. The arrangement was a profit participation deal, confirmed in 1955 by Universal executive William Goetz to the Los Angeles Times, and its origins traced back to Winchester 73 in 1950, where agent Lou Wasserman negotiated approximately 50% of net profits in place of salary. That first deal alone netted Stewart around $600,000 from a single Western, and the model he and Wasserman established is widely recognized as one of the first major profit participation agreements in Hollywood history. Studios had always held the financial power in their relationships with talent, and this arrangement shifted some of that power back toward the performer in a way the industry hadn't seen before. By the time The Far Country was shooting in the summer and fall of 1953, taking a cut of profits rather than a fixed fee was simply how Stewart operated. The $300,000 he walked away with from this one film made the point clearly enough. Fact number 4. The villain was based on a real criminal, and his descendants threatened to sue. Judge Gannon, played with what critics called charmingly malevolent conviction by John McIntyre, runs Skagway like a personal criminal empire, hiding extortion and murder behind a mask of civic authority. The blueprint for that character came from a real man, Jefferson Randolph "Soapy" Smith, a confidence artist who controlled Skagway during the actual Klondike Gold Rush of 1897 and 1898. Smith commanded a gang of 200 to 300 men, ran elaborate cons including a fake telegraph office that bilked new arrivals out of their money, and met his end on July 8, 1898, in what history records as the shootout on Juneau Wharf. His story had become Alaskan legend long before Hollywood arrived. When Universal began developing the film, Smith's descendants threatened legal action if the studio depicted Soapy in a negative light, and the studio's response was simple: change the name to Gannon, and leave everything else exactly as written. Fact number 5. The film premiered in London, nearly 7 months before New York saw it. London audiences got The Far Country on July 22, 1954. New York didn't see it until February 12, 1955, with Los Angeles following 4 days after that on February 16, nearly 7 months after the British premiere, which for a Hollywood studio production of that era was genuinely unusual. Most Universal International releases followed a domestic-first pattern, and no publicly available studio record explains why this one broke from it. The copyright registration, dated May 13, 1954, confirms the film had been completed and cleared months before any American theater showed it. What that meant in practice was that British critics and audiences spent the better part of a year watching, reviewing, and discussing a James Stewart Western that most people in the country where it was made hadn't yet had any opportunity to see. Fact number 6. The screenplay may be an uncredited adaptation of a 1942 novel. Borden Chase carried the sole screen credit for story and screenplay on The Far Country, officially classifying it as original material, and Chase had earned that designation on Winchester 73 and Bend of the River before it. But film historians notice something that Universal never addressed publicly. Ernest Haycock's 1942 novel Alder Gulch contains a protagonist named Jeff, a woman named Miss Castle, villains named Ketchum and Ives, and a loner protagonist dynamic that drives the story in directions very familiar to anyone who has watched The Far Country carefully. Haycock's received no credit. The connection has remained disputed for decades, with at least one prominent Western film critic who read both works concluding there was almost no connection, beyond both being tales of skullduggery in cold northern lands. Whether Chase borrowed deliberately, arrived at similar territory independently, or something more complicated happened between the two works, Universal has never formally weighed in, and the authorship question sits unresolved in the film's production history. Fact number 7. Filming in Canada nearly ended in disaster, and a mountaineer saved a cast member's life. None of The Far Country was actually shot in Alaska or the Yukon, despite that being where the story takes place. Production moved to Jasper National Park in Alberta, Canada, where the crew worked around the Athabasca Glacier, the Columbia Icefields, Mount Edith Cavell, and Saskatchewan Glacier, all standing in for Klondike Gold Rush territory. The location advisor on the shoot was Bruno Engler, a Swiss-born mountaineer and photographer who had settled in the Canadian Rockies, and he gave Anthony Mann an explicit warning: shooting at 3 in the afternoon created serious avalanche risk. Mann dismissed it. According to records now held at the White Museum of the Canadian Rockies, massive amounts of snow and ice subsequently came down during an afternoon shoot, putting everyone on set in genuine danger. Engler's intervention saved at least one of the film stars, and the crew's respect for him afterward ran deep enough that he became known as the God of the Glacier. The film's closing credits carry a formal acknowledgement: "We gratefully acknowledge the splendid cooperation extended to the Far Country cast and crew by all concerned at Jasper National Park, Alberta, Canada. And if a near-fatal avalanche that a director ignored didn't keep you from watching, one click certainly won't. Subscribe to the channel right now and hit the bell, because Ben Tatum would have wanted you to know when we're coming." Fact number 8. A modern automobile is visible in the opening credits, in a film set in 1896. The title sequence of The Far Country plays over a photograph of the Athabasca Glacier, meant to establish the vast, untouched wilderness of the Klondike frontier. Running across the bottom of that glacier image, clearly visible to anyone who looks for it, an ice road carries a modern automobile. This in a film whose story begins in 1896, decades before automobiles existed anywhere in the Yukon. No subtle continuity error buried in a crowd scene midway through the picture. This one sits in the title sequence, before a word of dialogue has been spoken, in the very first thing the audience sees. For a Western built around frontier ruggedness and pre-industrial hardship, it is a startling way to begin, and it has been sitting there in plain sight for more than 70 years. Fact number 9. Henry Mancini secretly helped score the film before the world knew his name. Joseph Gershenson received the musical director credit on The Far Country, as he did on most Universal productions of the period, because Gershenson ran the studio's music department and his name went on the work that department produced. The actual composers who wrote the score were 4 Universal staff writers working without any screen credit: Hans Salter, Frank Skinner, Herman Stein, and Henry Mancini. That last name deserves a pause. Mancini would go on to write Moon River for Breakfast at Tiffany's, the theme from The Pink Panther, and dozens of other compositions that became permanent fixtures in the culture, collecting 4 Academy Awards and 20 Grammy Awards along the way. In 1954, none of that had happened yet. He was a young apprentice at Universal, contributing anonymously to well over 100 films as part of his apprenticeship before the Peter Gunn television score in 1958 finally broke him into the open. Some of the music filling The Far Country's glacial exteriors and tense interiors came from one of the greatest composers the film industry ever produced, and his name appears nowhere in the credits. Fact number 10. The cinematographer had shot 21 Greta Garbo films. William H. Daniels carried the camera on The Far Country, and his background made him one of the most experienced and decorated cinematographers working in Hollywood. 21 Greta Garbo films between 1926 and 1939 established him as her personal director of photography. She trusted him so completely that no major project of hers moved forward without him. His Oscar for The Naked City in 1948 confirmed what the industry already knew, and 9 films with Frank Sinatra followed later in his career. Serving as president of the American Society of Cinematographers from 1961 to 1963 placed him at the formal head of his profession. For The Far Country, Daniels shot the entire production in Technicolor and framed it carefully enough to accommodate multiple presentation formats. Universal prepared prints in standard Academy ratio, matted widescreen at 1.85:1, and a proprietary 2:1 ratio that competed directly with Fox's CinemaScope system. That deliberate flexibility in the framing is precisely why Arrow Academy's Blu-ray restoration, released in November of 2019, includes 2 separate discs presenting the film in 2 different aspect ratios. Decades before restoration became a conversation anyone was having, Daniels had already shot the material to survive it. Fact number 11. Walter Brennan and James Stewart had never worked together before. 3 Academy Awards for Best Supporting Actor, Come and Get It in 1936, Kentucky in 1938, and The Westerner in 1940, made Walter Brennan the only male performer in history to reach that number, and by the time he arrived on the set of The Far Country at 59 years old, 2 decades of stardom sat behind him. Stewart's resume matched it: an Oscar since 1940, a commercial record that studios relied on, and a public reputation that survived the war and grew stronger afterward. And yet the 2 men had never appeared in the same film before this one. Their only subsequent collaboration was the ensemble epic How the West Was Won in 1962, which meant The Far Country represented the full depth of a screen partnership between 2 of Hollywood's most beloved performers. Brennan plays Ben Tatum, the trail partner whose gentle philosophy about friendship, coffee, and a bell on a ranch house door provides the film's emotional center, and his murder in the final act carries the weight it does, partly because audiences sense, watching the 2 men together, that something genuinely irreplaceable is being taken away. Fact number 12. The villain was a 3-time Anthony Mann bad guy. John McIntyre's Judge Gannon is the 3rd villain he played for Anthony Mann, following his antagonist role in Winchester 73 in 1950 and preceding another bad turn in The Tin Star in 1957. Born June 27, 1907 in Spokane, Washington, McIntyre grew up around ranchers, and that background gave him an unhurried, grounded quality that made his villains feel more plausible than theatrical. Mann clearly recognized what he had in McIntyre and kept coming back. The character of Gannon carries a specific complexity that critics have noted more than once. In a more traditional Western, he might easily occupy the hero's role, a tough authority figure willing to break rules to maintain order. The fact that the film positions him firmly as the villain says something deliberate about the kind of moral universe Anthony Mann was building in these pictures. Television audiences later found McIntyre as a replacement lead on Wagon Train from 1961 to 1965, and on The Virginian from 1967 to 1970, which is how most people remember him today. But Mann got there first, and Mann used him better. Fact number 13. Jack Elam, famous for dying early, survives to the final reel. A career built on dying early had earned Jack Elam the nickname One Reel Jack, and Western audiences of the 1950s understood the reference immediately. If Elam appeared in a picture, his elimination came fast, signaling that real danger existed and the hero had genuine enemies. Picture after picture deployed him this way, sometimes dispatching him within the first few minutes of screen time. The Far Country breaks the pattern entirely. Elam plays Newberry, one of Judge Gannon's hired gunmen, and he's still standing when the climactic confrontation arrives, which for audiences who had watched him get shot out of films for years, represented a small but genuine subversion. That kind of casting intelligence, knowing what an audience expects from a specific face and then quietly denying it, ran through the way Mann assembled these pictures, rewarding the viewers who paid attention to the character actors working around the edges of the frame. Fact number 14. Harry Morgan was credited under the wrong name. Henry Morgan appears in the credits of The Far Country playing Ketchum, one of Judge Gannon's enforcers, and that credit is technically incorrect, or at least it applies a name that history wouldn't ultimately attach to him. Born Harry Bratsburg, the actor adopted Henry Morgan as a stage name in 1942 specifically to avoid confusion with the unrelated comedian and radio personality who carried the same name. By the mid-1950s, the switchover back to Harry was underway, but the transition hadn't completed by the time The Far Country went into production and release. Most people who encounter his work today know him as Colonel Sherman T. Potter from MASH, the role he occupied from 1975 to 1983, and for which he won an Emmy Award. Every cast list that credits Harry Morgan in The Far Country is applying a name that wouldn't appear on his screen credits for several more years. Fact number 15. The horse pie performed a midnight miracle in a single take. Sweetie Pie, or simply Pie as Stewart called him throughout his career, was a sorrel Arabian quarter horse mix belonging to Stevie Myers, whose father had worked as a wrangler for Tom Mix and W.S. Hart. Over 22 years, Stewart rode Pie in 17 westerns, and no other actor was ever permitted to put Stevie Myers' horse on screen. The bond between man and animal ran deep enough that the screenplay for The Far Country writes it in directly. During the ride to Dawson, Jeff Webster's line "Pie picked up a stone" uses the real horse's name, folding the actual relationship into the fiction as though the two were inseparable, which for practical purposes they were, and then comes the sequence that everyone who has seen the film remembers, whether they know why or not. With Ben Tatum's silver bell attached to the saddle, Pie walks alone down a dark street at night, the jingling meant to draw out the gunman waiting in ambush. The camera follows a riderless horse moving through darkness, no human action carrying the scene, just an animal, a bell and a director trusting the moment completely. That sequence filmed at 3 a.m. with full artificial lighting, and before the cameras rolled, Stewart walked to Pie and whispered his instructions. One take. No hesitation. The horse walked it perfectly. Stewart told the story himself. Somebody came up and said, "How are you ever going to get the horse to do this?" I said, "Well, let me talk to him." I said, "Do it right now," and Pie did it. Mann's response afterward was simple. "I swear the horse looks back at him and smiles." Henry Fonda painted a portrait of Pie that hung in Stewart's home for the rest of his life. Pie died in 1970 and was buried on Stewart's California ranch, and if a horse performing in one take at 3 a.m. after being whispered to by Jimmy Stewart doesn't make you want to leave a like on this video, nothing will hit it, and drop a comment with your favorite fact so far because we want to know. Fact number 16. The bell is the film's true emotional center, and its final image. A small silver bell purchased in Mexico by an old man who wants it on a ranch house door in Utah, so that when visitors arrive, the jingle lets him put on a fresh pot of coffee. Turns out to be what The Far Country is actually about. Ben Tatum's explanation of the bell in the early scenes is the film's thesis statement dressed up as ordinary dialogue, and everything that follows measures itself against that simple wish, to know when your friends are coming, to be ready for them, to exist in relationship with other people rather than apart from them. Jeff Webster, who carries the bell on his saddle horn throughout the picture, while insisting he owes nothing to anyone, is walking around with the argument against his own philosophy dangling from his saddle, and the film is patient enough to let that irony develop slowly. Ben is murdered, the bell gets attached to Pie's saddle and sent jingling through darkness as a decoy. And then the gunfight ends, the dust settles, and the film refuses every conventional closing it could have chosen. No romantic embrace, no triumphant departure, no sunset. Jeff Webster stands alone and rings Ben's bell in memorial, and that single image, a solitary man and a small silver object purchased for a house that will never be built, closes the picture. Critics have spent decades noting that the film doesn't end the way westerns are supposed to end, and that's the point. The Far Country is, among other things, a film about what it costs a man to remain unreachable, and the bell is the measure of that cost from the first scene to the last. Fact number 17. The final gunfight is deliberately unheroic. Most westerns of the 1950s closed their accounts in the open street, two figures standing upright in clean geometry. The visual language of honorable combat rendered in bright light and unambiguous framing. The closing confrontation of the Far Country goes nowhere near any of that. Jeff Webster, shot and badly wounded before the final sequence begins, fights his way through the climax on the ground, crawling through mud in the dark, scraping toward survival by inches rather than striding toward resolution with any dignity. The deliberate clumsiness, the refusal of any glamour, the insistence that this is ugly and painful rather than cathartic, these choices put the film well ahead of the revisionist Western tradition that wouldn't fully emerge until the following decade. Some film scholars have drawn a direct line from this ending to the similarly gritty, snowbound finale of Robert Altman's McCabe and Mrs. Miller in 1971, though that remains critical speculation rather than anything Altman confirmed. The formal parallel between the two conclusions is close enough that the comparison keeps getting made. Fact number 18. The film completely ignores the Northwest Mounted Police. Set in 1896 during the Klondike Gold Rush, in and around Skagway and Dawson City in what was then the Canadian Yukon, the Far Country depicts Dawson as a lawless frontier settlement where citizens must organize their own protection against a criminal power structure by electing an American-style marshal with a tin badge. That premise rests on a significant historical fiction. Throughout the actual gold rush, the Northwest Mounted Police, the organization that would become the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, maintained a strong and effective presence in the Yukon, and their authority made Canadian Klondike Territory considerably more orderly than comparable American frontier settlements of the period. The film erases all of that, replacing Canadian institutional law enforcement with an American frontier mythology because the Western genre storytelling conventions required it. One Canadian commentator observed directly, "Marshals and cowboy gunfighters, that was America's history of the Old West. It's rather insulting for Canadians." The Chilkat people, indigenous to the region and significantly affected by the gold rush, receive only a passing reference in the film despite their historical centrality to the territory being depicted. Fact number 19. Corinne Calvet studied criminal law at the Sorbonne. Criminal law at the Sorbonne in Paris is not the typical academic path that leads to playing a love interest in a frontier western, but Corinne Calvet, born Corinne Dibis on April 30, 1925, arrived in Hollywood by exactly that route. Producer Hal Wallace discovered her, and the publicity machine described her as a combination of Marlene Dietrich and Rita Hayworth, which was the studio's way of preparing audiences for someone who combined European sophistication with photogenic appeal. In the Far Country, she plays Renee Vallon, called Freckleface throughout the picture, positioned as the wholesome counterpart to Ruth Roman's more worldly Rhonda Castle. Her 1983 memoir, Has Corinne Been a Good Girl?, contains her own assessment of what Hollywood offered her. The industry never challenged her acting ability. She eventually left the profession and became a hypnotherapist. Ruth Roman, who plays the other half of Jeff Webster's romantic dilemma, survived the sinking of the SS Andrea Doria in the North Atlantic in July of 1956, just 2 years after the Far Country's release, escaping with her young son in one of the most widely covered maritime disasters of the post-war era. Fact number 20. The Mann-Stewart partnership ended because of a script man called trash. 5 westerns across 5 years, and then nothing. The end of the Mann-Stewart collaboration traced back to a 1957 project called Night Passage, planned as their 6th western and the continuation of one of Hollywood's most productive creative partnerships. Mann read the screenplay, dismissed it as trash, and stated plainly that the story was so incoherent that I said the audience wouldn't understand any of it. The disagreement didn't stop there. Mann reportedly accused Stewart of wanting to make the film primarily so he could play the accordion on screen. Biographer Michael Munn, writing in Jimmy Stewart, The Truth Behind the Legend, recorded that Mann's remark infuriated Stewart so much that he never spoke to Mann again. Mann also objected to the casting of Audie Murphy, 5 feet 5 inches tall, as the brother of the 6'3" Stewart, though by the time that casting concern became relevant, Mann had already departed. Director James Nielsen finished Night Passage, and the finished film opened to poor reviews. The Far Country, made at the 4th step in a 5-film sequence, had been closer to the end of the partnership than anyone working on it could possibly have known. 20 facts about the Far Country, and most of them point toward the same conclusion. This was never a simple Western. Henry Mancini scored it without credit. A horse performed a midnight sequence in one perfect take after his rider whispered to him. A threatened lawsuit from a criminal's descendants gave the villain his fictional name. An avalanche nearly ended the production because a director ignored a mountaineer's warning. A modern car appears in the opening glacier photograph of a film set in 1896. And it all closes not with a romantic embrace or a triumphant exit, but with a lone man standing in the dark, ringing a dead man's bell. Shot between August and October of 1953 and released first in London, then across America through 1954 and into 1955, the film arrived at the midpoint of one of the most important creative partnerships the Western genre produced. Mann-Stewart and Rosenberg were operating at full capacity when they made it, and later critics most consistently place it at the bottom of the 5-film cycle, which, given that the bottom of that particular list holds a 100% critical approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, tells you more about the quality of the competition than it does about the film itself. Film scholar Janine Basinger, who wrote the defining academic study of Anthony Mann, argued that his westerns function on 3 levels at once: the literal surface narrative, the hero's psychological condition expressed through the physical world around him, and the emotional experience of the audience watching both. The Far Country earns that reading completely. The title names a real place, a Klondike destination, a gold rush frontier. It also names where Jeff Webster lives permanently, at a distance from other people, behind a philosophy of self-sufficiency that the film patiently and methodically dismantles over 97 minutes. And it names where the Western genre itself was heading, away from certainty, away from clean moral geometry, toward the complicated ground-level mud and darkness finales that would define what came after. Jeff Webster refuses to become part of anything larger than himself for most of the picture, turning down the badge, declining to defend the town, insisting that other people's problems sit outside his jurisdiction, and then his partner is killed, and he picks up a small silver bell, and he walks out into the dark. That movement from refusal to responsibility, paid for at a cost that doesn't resolve neatly into triumph, is what Anthony Mann's westerns kept returning to, film after film, until a disagreement over a script and an accordion finally ended the run. More than 70 years on, The Far Country still makes that journey feel earned,